Welcome back to our current teaching series, Reaching Out, looking at the ways that we as a church can continue to reach out to our neighborhood with the life-transforming love of Christ. I wonder, what kind of images come to your mind when you think about Christians reaching out? Maybe someone in a crowded city centre with a megaphone telling everyone that they're going to hell, turn or burn. Or maybe someone knocking at your door and asking if you have a minute to talk about our personal Saviour, Jesus Christ. Or perhaps if you're like me and you grew up in an evangelical church in the 90s, you have a horrible flashback to being forced to learn a skit so you can perform street evangelism as a teenager. They're all still in there, by the way. I could burst into song at literally any moment. But brushing off my personal trauma for a moment, I do wonder if sometimes when we think about reaching out, our brains sort of switch into this kind of advertising mode where we think about Jesus as this product that we need to somehow sell to our friends and family. Excuse me, have you tried Jesus? He will remove those stubborn stains, quench your thirst, and deal with that hunger in your soul. And he's completely free when you subscribe to this church for the rest of your life. Terms and conditions apply, some deconstruction required. I mean, it's not actually our fault, right? Because we are constantly being bombarded with advertising on our TVs, on our smartphones, on our computers. We can't get away from it. I've got some of those Alexa-enabled devices in my house, and I know she's always listening to me because anytime I talk about something obscure, like, I don't know, owning a grand piano, the next thing I know, I'm getting Amazon notifications on my phone for the latest Steinway. Everyone is always trying to sell us something. I bet you can still remember the advertising slogans from when you were younger, can't you? Have a break, have a Kit Kat. Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. Once you pop, you can't stop. It's like these adverts have rewired our brains. They've trained us to think in a particular way. And so when it comes to sharing the love of Jesus, often our natural inclination is to think about how we can convince others to buy this product. I mean, just look at some of the great Christian advertising slogans through the ages. What about, if you died tonight, do you know where you'd be? Have you ever heard that one? Or God won't give you more than you can handle. Sometimes when I hear people say that, I think, tell me that again and I'll give you more than you can handle. Or about when God closes a door, he opens a window. Never really understood that one. Why doesn't he just open another door? You know, windows are hard to get through, aren't they? Or one of the all-time greats, have you been washed in the blood of the Lamb? Ugh, honestly, whoever was on the advertising committee that particular day, I think needs to be fired. It's gross and unhygienic and makes little to no sense, even with a theology degree. Of course, the problem of trying to reach people by selling Jesus as this wonder product or miracle cure is that it doesn't really work like that, does it? To be clear, I'm not saying that Jesus isn't amazing. He is, or even that he doesn't perform miracles, because I think he does. It's just that life is a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Actually, sometimes following Jesus makes your life harder, not easier. And we all know anti-wrinkle creams don't really work. Besides, Jesus himself didn't really make it easy for us to market him, did he? He said some fairly challenging things, like if you want to be perfect, go and sell your possessions and give them to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. You know, if you want to be rich, don't follow Jesus, or at least don't follow him well. He said, if you want to be great, then you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be first must be a slave. You know, if you want to get ahead in life and be your own boss, then don't follow Jesus. He said, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. if you want to keep all your body parts, don't follow Jesus. Although we are hoping that one is metaphorical. And sometimes what we do as Christians is we put all the nice stuff, all the easy stuff up front, and we hide the more difficult stuff that Jesus said in the T's and C's and just kind of hope that no one ever reads them. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I want to be honest with you about what it really means to follow Jesus. But also, I think that some of the most counterintuitive commands of Jesus are the ones that cause us to perform the greatest examination of ourselves and, I believe, ultimately lead us to the best life possible. In other words, I think the hard stuff is actually really good for us. So with that in mind, today I want to look at one of the most challenging things that Jesus ever said. And it's found in Matthew 16, verse 24. He said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And this is a saying that we actually find throughout the Gospels. In Matthew 10:38, it says, "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me." In Luke 14:27, it says, "Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." And in Mark 8:34, again, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." It would appear that this is something Jesus said often, both to his disciples and those who were wanting to follow him. Hardly the catchiest of taglines, is it? I'm sure we'd have heard, "Whoever wants to be my disciple can," with no strings attached, and they get a free welcome pack. But that's not what Jesus said. I do think, though, that this particular phrase of Jesus has been misunderstood and abused in the past, particularly by Christians. I've heard this verse being taken to mean that every desire that we have is bad and therefore should be denied. When we think about self-denial, often we think of it as denying ourselves things, don't we? I won't allow myself to have an extra slice of cake because, I've got to fit into my good trousers next weekend. Or I won't allow myself to spend half my wages on a new 50-inch TV because I have to feed the kids. And my wife keeps telling me size doesn't matter. But sometimes Christians in particular take this further and suggest that every desire that we have is sinful or evil, that we cannot trust ourselves or even discern right from wrong apart from Jesus. And sadly, I've even come across believers who have told other believers that they cannot pursue a career or a particular relationship because they must deny themselves. That's not what this verse is talking about. Certainly, sometimes we make bad decisions. I rarely deny myself that extra slice of cake. But that doesn't mean that every decision that I make is bad. I am, after all, made in the image of God. Jesus has called me to be a light to the world. I am capable of making good decisions about my life, and so are you. I've also heard this verse being used to say that Jesus has given us a particular burden that he expects us to deal with a smile on our face. Sometimes this verse is confused with the popular saying, "We all have our crosses to bear," which, can be applied in a variety of different ways, can't it? Some of them kind of silly. I got to spend the weekend with the in-laws. That's my cross to bear. And some of them not so silly, like those suffering with long-term sickness or disability, those trapped in difficult relationships or family situations, those dealing with addiction. But again, sometimes Christians take it even further and suggest that those difficult things are our personal crosses that we must carry, that we have to carry if we're going to be good disciples of Jesus. I've had friends that have stayed in horrendous situations, painful and toxic environments, because they believed passionately that they were called to suffering, that the situation they were in was the particular way that Jesus was expecting them to suffer. I find that heartbreaking. And I want to be clear with you today that Jesus has not called you to a life of suffering. He said, The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. He hasn't said you won't suffer, or that things will always be easy, or even that you won't face persecution. He actually said in this life you will have trouble. But it was Jesus' cross that was the cross of suffering, not ours. So what exactly is it that Jesus is calling us to do by denying ourselves and taking up our cross? Well, let's look at this idea of self-denial. What is really being asked of us here? If we look at the words in the original Greek, the meaning is perhaps closer to a turning away from or a refusing to follow, and it's almost always connected to a person. And so what's being suggested here is not so much the refusing of pleasure, but rather the turning away from ourselves in favor of something else, in this case, Jesus. It's a process of self-examination, not self-refusal. Jesus is not making a statement about our inherent sinfulness so much as he's asking us to consider who it is that we are following, ourselves and our desires, or him and his desires for us. Now, that's a trickier question, isn't it? Because it requires us to firstly understand what Jesus wants us to do, and then secondly, make sure that our motives are in line with his motives. So if Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself, which he did, by the way, then denying ourselves in this context is about making sure that the things that we want and the things that we do demonstrate a love for God and a love for others. So I need to consider if eating that extra slice of cake is loving God, who gave me this body in which I live and serve, or if it's loving towards my neighbor who might not have any cake at all. Now, that's a bit more difficult, isn't it? You see, the self-denial that Jesus calls us to is not about intentionally making ourselves miserable. It's about discovering a life that is intentionally loving. What did John say? He said, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Okay, so what about the taking up your cross bit? Well, Jesus actually said this before he was crucified, but the practice of crucifixion was common throughout the Roman Empire, and it would have most certainly brought a very vivid image into the minds of his listeners. You see, crucifixion was reserved for those who had rebelled against the empire in some way, perhaps tried to lead a revolt or maybe cause some civil unrest. For example, when the Jewish leaders were trying to convince Pilate to crucify Jesus, they claimed that he was opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and therefore setting himself up as some kind of new king or ruler. Crucifixion then was used as a way of both wiping out the threat and deterring any future would-be rebels, and essentially they would humiliate their victims by forcing them to carry their own instrument of death. They were providing an image of total submission as the criminals struggled under the weight of their own cross and walked to their execution. Crosses aren't things that we occasionally pick up or carry, or even like burdens that we bear. Crosses are an image of total submission to the will of the one in authority over us. Actually, the Apostle Paul uses a similar but different metaphor in 2 Corinthians 2:14. He says, but thanks be to God who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of the knowledge of him everywhere. He's referring to the practice of Roman generals returning victorious from battle with foreign captives in chains behind them, totally conquered, totally submitted to the empire, or in Paul's mind, Christ. Now, if you're finding these metaphors a little uncomfortable, I get it, because who wants to think of themselves as being held captive or led towards their execution? Again, it's not an easy sell, is it? But I think Jesus is using intentionally harsh language here because there is a reality that we need to be aware of. The fact that following Jesus has a cost. It's interesting when you look at the specific places that Jesus uses the phrase, take up your cross. Remember, when you remove the text from its context, all you're left with is a con. In Matthew 10, Jesus is commissioning his disciples and sending them out to proclaim the message of the kingdom of heaven. And he warns them. He says, guys, this isn't going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be really, really tough. He tells them that they're going to be like sheep among wolves. He talks about the local councils arresting them. He talks about them receiving floggings in the synagogue. Floggings don't tend to be a part of our worship services anymore, but you don't know, they might come back. But what he's talking about is the hatred that they will receive as carriers of his message. Even, he says, perhaps from their own family and friends, because Jesus' message was offensive to the Jewish people in the first century. He was claiming to be the Messiah. And the Jewish leaders, well, they thought he was leading people astray. So he said to his followers, look, if they call me Beelzebub, then imagine what they're going to call you. But he also said, look, if you stick with me, if you acknowledge me before my Father in heaven, things will be okay in the end. And he said, don't worry, because I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit to help you through those difficult times. Picking up your cross should remind you of how hard this journey is going to be. In Luke 14, the verse appears just before a couple of short stories or parables about counting the cost. The first is about someone wanting to build a tower. He says, if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, then everyone who sees it will ridicule you. And the second is about a king who goes to war against another king. And he's trying to work out if he has enough men in his army to stand against the oncoming army. And in both cases, Jesus wants his hearers to recognize that being a disciple should not be something you enter into half-heartedly. Otherwise, it won't stand up to the tough times ahead. Picking up your cross should remind you of how much this is actually going to cost you in the long run. Matthew 16 and Mark 8 tell the same story, and it's that occasion where Jesus is asking his followers, who do you say I am? Never mind about anyone else. What about you? And Peter boldly declares, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, yes, well done, Pete. That's it, exactly. I'm going to use you to build my church. You're my rock, buddy. I can rely on you. But then Jesus goes on to talk about how he would suffer. And Peter doesn't like that bit. So he says, no, Lord, that's never going to happen. You know, we'll defend you, Jesus. We've got your back. Don't worry about it. But Jesus turns to Peter and says, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, only human concerns. If you're going to follow me, then you're going to have to pick up your cross and accept that there will be some suffering before the end comes. So picking up our cross, it's not about bearing a particular burden. It's about being all in. It's about knowing that whatever difficulties lie ahead, whatever suffering there might be down the road, we are committed. Because, once you pick up your cross, there's no going back. But there's a final piece to this puzzle. Yes, Jesus said, deny yourself. Make sure you're submitted to my will for your life. Yes, Jesus said, pick up your cross. Make sure you're all in, that you've counted the cost before you begin this journey. But he also said, follow me. You see, being a Christian is not about having this miracle product. Take Jesus twice daily with water and all will be well. It's about having a constant companion on the journey of life. It's about having someone that you can look to in the storm, someone who is with you in the boat, someone who won't abandon you at the first sign of trouble. It's about having someone who knows what it is to suffer. Jesus didn't pick up a metaphorical cross. He picked up a real one on our behalf. He faced rejection and shame and endured ridicule and scorn. And he breathed in the sin of the world and breathed back forgiveness and grace. And Jesus doesn't call us to anything that he hasn't been through himself, or anything that he isn't prepared to go through with us. Recently I led my 10-year-old son up Snowdon. That's the highest peak in Wales, if you don't know. And there are some parts of that mountain, even on the easier tracks, that are really, really tough, quite grueling, parts where you might think, oh, I'm not sure that I can do this. I'm not sure I'm going to make it. And indeed, there are parts where my son, with his little legs, really struggled. But I was able to say to him, it's okay. Just around this corner, there's a place where we can stop for a bit. There's a place we can rest. Just over that ridge, it levels off for a bit. It goes flatter. We can take a break. We're nearly there. It's not far now. Just keep following me. And I was able to say these things because I've climbed Snowdon before. I know the lay of the land. I know the places to rest and the places to push on. And so I could say to him, trust me. Don't listen to your own head that's telling you to give up, because I know you can do this. I said, pick up your backpack and press on, because this is going to be worth it. And I showed him the way to the top. And when we got there, it was the sweetest thing. As we got to the last step of the summit, he said, wait, Dad, let's do it together. And we took the last step in perfect unison. And we were able to look out at, well, nothing actually, because it was a really cloudy day. But it still felt great that he had trusted me to get him there. This is the way that I believe Jesus wants us to trust him, the way that he wants us to follow him. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. It might not work as an advertising slogan, but if we're prepared to do things Jesus' way, then I truly believe he has some incredible places he wants to take us. Jesus is not a quick fix or an easy answer. Unless you're in Sunday school, then Jesus is always the answer. But if we're prepared to listen to him over and above ourselves, then he will lead us into this life defined by love and generosity and kindness and mercy and grace. He will change everything, even the way that we think. And we won't always get it right, but he's patient with us. He allows us to try again, just as he did with Peter. Yes, there will be some tough times ahead. There may even be persecution or suffering that comes as a result of choosing to follow Jesus. But if we remain committed to him, he will look after us. He will see us through. He will journey with us. He said, I will be with you always. Yes, even until the end of the age. And if we choose to follow him the way that Jesus is calling us to, making him our highest priority, then perhaps those around us will begin to see that Jesus is worth giving up everything for. Perhaps we can reach out by denying ourselves, picking up our cross, and following him. Let me finish with the Apostle Paul's words to the Romans. He says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.